Let's begin with a prayer. St. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, said, Christ is our peace. He made us one and broke down the dividing walls of enmity. Lord Jesus Christ, today we gather as one family, united in your love, for the dialogue of love, dialogue of truth, and dialogue of life. We ask you to send the Holy Spirit upon us to guide our dialogue and to teach us how to practice fraternal charity. We ask this to Christ our Lord. Amen. As the director for the Nesti Center for Faith and Culture, I'm honored to welcome all of you, friends, supporters of the Nesti Center for Faith and Culture. I also extend a warm welcome to all who are our new brothers and sisters in the dialogue. The Nesti Center was founded 26 years ago by Father Donald Nesti, a priest of the Missionary Order of the Congregation of the Holy Spirit. Father Nesti's vision was to gather people from various cultural, social, and religious backgrounds to encounter, to accompany one another, and to dialogue and to discern the mission of being faithful and faithful citizens. So the Nesti Center ever since has embraced the mission of setting the table for encounter dialogue, for companionship, and for discernment concerning the critical issues that we are nowadays facing. Today's lecture presentations of Dr. Faggioli on the new encyclical of Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, will be significantly important for us to initiate our table of encounter dialogue. Now I invite Dr. Stuart Squires, the Associate Director of the Nesti Center, to introduce our distinguishing speaker.
Thank you very much. Theology in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University, the great Augustinian University in Philadelphia. He earned his PhD in religious history from the University of Turin in Turin, Italy in 2002, and has received degrees from the University of Bologna in Bologna, Italy, and probably best known as a contributing writer for Commonweal magazine. His books and articles have been published in more than 10 languages. His most recent publications include the books A Counsel for the Global Church, Receiving Vatican II in History, published by Fortress Press, The Rising Laity, Ecclesial Movements Since Vatican II by Paulist Press, and Catholicism and Citizenship, Political Cultures of the Church in the 21st Century, published by Liturgical Press. His latest book is The Liminal Papacy of Pope Francis, Moving Toward Global Catholicity, published by Orbis Books this year, 2020. And he is co-editing with Catherine Clifford the Oxford Book of Vatican II, due to come out next year by Oxford University Press. He lives in Philadelphia, in the Philadelphia area, with his wife and 2 children. And the title of his presentation today is Human Fraternity in the Age of Walls, Pope Francis's Encyclical Fratelli Tutti. Dr. Faggioli, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind presentation, and to the University of St. Thomas for the invitation to talk about the latest encyclical of Pope Francis. It's always very engaging for a scholar to talk about a new encyclical. It's a great way to study more a very important text of the Pope. And so I'm really grateful for this invitation. I was supposed to be there in person, but here we are. We were trying to make the best of the situation. So, human fraternity in the age of walls. So, I believe that the importance of this encyclical of Pope Francis is in the text, of course, but is also in the choice of time and in the context in which this encyclical was imagined, was drafted, and was published. Because this is a new age of walls. It's a concept that Pope Francis is repeated many times, not just in the encyclical, but throughout his whole pontificate. Yes, he said many times that more than 30 years almost after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we are now in an era of building new walls. In some cases, these walls are literal, are symbolical, or they are promised as electoral promises, unfulfilled promises. In some other cases, they are figurative, as in the case of Brexit, which could once again raise a new wall between Ireland and Northern Ireland, for example. And so it's a new age of walls because it has been studied recently, and there was an interesting essay in the journal The Atlantic in 2016 that reported that of the 51 fortified boundaries built between countries since the end of World War II, since 1945, around half of them were built between 2000 and 2014. And so this is a new age of walls. It's the product of the crisis of our globalized world, of a series of traumas of 9/11, of the global financial crisis of 2008-9, of immigration. And so here, these walls are really trying to make us more separated, and through physical barriers. So here there is, I just want to give you a short picture and map of where these walls are, the old ones and the new ones. So here, the longest and oldest functioning is in Northern Africa between Morocco, Algeria, and Mauritania. The newest wall is in Syria, is in the city of Homs, which I visited in July 2001. Walls between different neighborhoods where different ethnic groups live. Now India is building a 2,500-mile barbed wire fence around its neighbor Bangladesh. There's a very famous rich-poor divide in Sao Paulo, Brazil. A new wall was built in Israel, between Israel and the West Bank in 2002. The newest border of Europe is the one between Greece and Turkey near the Evros River. One of the longest standing are the walls between Belfast and Derry in Northern Ireland, built in 1969. It's a series of 99 separate walls. There's the wall that is separating the two Koreas that was built in 1953, the wall between Melilla and Ceuta in Northern Africa, which is this Spanish exclave in Northern Africa, and then in Cyprus, in Nicosia, a wall that has been built in the 1970s. So here, walls are part of our geography, of our political geography, but also of our human and spiritual geography. So here there is a very interesting column that was written by an Australian journalist in the Sydney Morning Herald in 2019. So where he was talking about the effects of the immigration policies of Australia towards migrants. And he was writing something that I think is important. So quote, "A wall doesn't just exclude, it obscures, it renders those on the other side invisible. And once people are invisible, they become mythological beasts. Their lives, their attitudes, their aspirations all become figments of our imagination." End quote. And so this is what walls do. It's not just a physical separation of people, but also of a creation of an alien, of an other that is distorted. And so we live in a new age of walls, not just because new physical walls are being built, but also because there are new kinds of technological walls that are enforced with geofencing, with GPS, with modern technology. It's part of the so-called rise of the surveillance state, so where everyone can be controlled quite easily by a big brother, whether it's a state actor or non-state actor. There are new kinds of walls that are invisible within our societies, the effect of the so-called big sword. So where all of us are encouraged or are pushed to live in communities of people that look the same, earn more or less the same, that are socially part of the same strata. And there's also a big sword in our churches, in our religious communities, where we know that of this phenomenon of shopping for a parish, which is good for you, also ideologically, also politically. So here, this is really a new age of walls. And Pope Francis' encyclical, I believe, is very, very important because it summarizes Pope Francis' thinking on human fraternity and on our global world. And there are many passages in which Pope Francis uses this image of the wall to describe the situation of our world and to make a different proposal. So here in the next section of this talk, I will read from some paragraphs of the Encyclical Fratelli Tutti that mention the issue of wall. So here at the very beginning, Pope Francis explains the Franciscan inspiration of this encyclical, and the fourth paragraph, he talks about the world at the time of Saint Francis, and he wrote this, quote, "In the world of that time, bristling with watchtowers and defensive walls, cities were a theater of brutal wars between powerful families, even as poverty was spreading through the countryside. Yet there, St. Francis, was able to welcome true peace into his heart and free himself of the desire to wield power over others. And so here walls are a human phenomenon that were very well known also to St. Francis, to that particular region of central Italy, so where every little town had its own walls, its own tower. So it's not something modern only or postmodern only. It's really part of human history and even of church history. At paragraph 27, Pope Francis develops this idea of the effects of walls, and he describes the effect of walls on our psyche, on our imagination. Paragraph 27. Today, too, outside the ancient town walls lies the abyss, the territory of the unknown, the wilderness. Whatever comes from there cannot be trusted, for it is unknown, unfamiliar, not part of the village. It is the territory of the barbarian, from whom we must defend ourselves at all costs. As a result, new walls are erected for self-preservation. The outside world ceases to exist and leaves only my world, to the point that others, no longer considered human beings, possessed of an inalienable dignity, become only them. Once more, we encounter the temptation to build a culture of walls, to raise walls, walls in the heart, walls on the land, in order to prevent this encounter with other cultures, with other people. And then at the end of this paragraph, there is a very famous quote that he gave in a press conference, where he says, "And those who raise walls will end up as slaves within the very walls they have built. They are left without horizons, for they lack this interchange with others." End quote. So here walls don't have just a social effect, a political dimension, an economic impact, but they also have a psychological and spiritual impact. Because Francis, in this encyclical, makes very clear that a world with walls, it's a poorer world that is more distant, but not distance as is necessitated for medical reasons, but it becomes a sickness. It's not a health device, but it becomes its own sickness, which in the end results to isolation and to a particular kind of spiritual disease that he talks about in the entire encyclical, especially at 35, where he says, when we discover how rich life is beyond walls, quote, "If only we might rediscover once for all that we need one another, and that in this way our human family can experience a rebirth with all its faces, all its hands, and all its voices beyond the walls that we have erected," end quote. And so this is a very strong emphasis. Also at paragraph 146, here Pope Francis warns against, quote, "a kind of local narcissism unrelated to a healthy love of one's own people and culture. It is born of a certain insecurity and fear of the other that leads to rejection and a desire to erect walls for self-defense," end quote. So here there is a necessity to be local, to know your local community, to be attached to your culture. But as long as this border is porous enough to permit some circulation between the local and the universal. And so this is important. And one final paragraph that I want to quote, also in light of what happened this morning in France, in Nice, the terrorist attack in the Basilica of Nice. Here Francis unites a certain tendency to build new walls in light of the very postmodern connection that there is between religion and violence. So here Pope Francis, paragraph 284 says, quote, "At times, fundamentalist violence is unleashed in some groups of whatever religion by the rashness of their leaders. Yet, the commandment of peace is inscribed in the depths of the religious traditions that we represent. As religious leaders, we are called to be true people of dialogue." And then a couple of lines down, "Each one of us is called to be an artisan of peace by uniting and not dividing, by extinguishing hatred and not holding on to it, by opening paths of dialogue and not by constructing new walls." This is courageous. It's not easy for a pope who knows very well that part of our world is made of strongly held religious convictions that can become violent and that can really lead to murder sometimes. And so here Francis understands this instinct to defend ourselves with walls, but at the same time he's making a very subtle but very, very courageous argument for the need for religions to be agent of dialogue and not of building walls. Now, how is this encyclical placed in Pope Francis' teaching? Many have said that this encyclical could be the final encyclical of Pope Francis. Pope Francis has been Pope for almost 8 years. He's almost 84. And so we don't know that, but clearly it's an encyclical that builds a picture in his whole pontificate, and I would say a triangle with the encyclical Laudato Si on creation of 2015, and with the declaration of Abu Dhabi on human fraternity for world peace and living together of 2019. In this encyclical, Francis is building on top of everything he has done before, but especially when we look at the image of walls, there is a very direct, even if it's not always clear, connection with the most important theological reference for Pope Francis in modern church history, which is the Second Vatican Council. So here, I think in Pope Francis there's a lot of one of his predecessors, Pope John the 23rd, whose vision for the Second Vatican Council was very, very clearly for a vision of the church and of the world as a one human family. So we see that in the opening speech of the Second Vatican Council of the 12th of October 1962, Gaudet Mater Ecclesia, and also in the first short but public document that was approved by the bishops at the Second Vatican Council, one of the informal messages that unfortunately are not printed in the volumes of the documents of the Second Vatican Council, that is the message to humanity of the 20th of October 1962, where there is very explicitly this vision of a servant church in the one world of the one human family. 1962, it's one of the most remarkable moments in modern church history, which was really elaborating theologically the events of those years. So we tend to associate, especially in the Western world, the decades of the Second Vatican Council, the 60s with the Beatles, Woodstock, and so on. But actually, it was also a decade of walls and of confrontation. So here, historians know that how deep was the impact on the Pope and on the bishops and on the theologians at the Second Vatican Council of the Berlin Wall, which was built in the summer of 1961 when Vatican II was being prepared, and also of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which occupied basically the first 2 weeks of the opening of the Second Vatican Council in October 1962. So here, walls, so those traumas of the Cold War are really extremely important for the elaboration of the Second Vatican Council of modernity, of political modernity, and of ecclesiology. And so we see that thin red line between Vatican II and Francis also in the way he understands this phenomenon of building walls. And so that's why from the standpoint of the political scientist or of those who observe with interest our political systems, the strongest sections in Fratelli Tutti are against populism and nationalism, on war, on death penalty, on the justice system. So I'm not breaking any news by saying that this encyclical speaks with a particularly loud voice to the United States, because we know that in this global crisis of the international order, so there is a very important, unique role for the United States. And of course, we are just a few days from the election of the new president. And so this encyclical is really a message in a particular way, I would say, to US Catholics and to the United States in general, especially one section that has to do with our walled-in communities, our gay communities. There is a remarkable section in Fratelli Tutti that is about social conflict and on the roots of conflicts. It's really courageous, this document, which says the imperative of forgiveness and of reconciliation for Catholics cannot be used to silence the need for justice. And he is, of course, making reference to economic justice, social justice, but also racial justice. So here again, forgiveness and reconciliation cannot be used to silence the need for justice. And so this has a very, very clear intra-Western dimension in democracies in the Western Hemisphere. But another section, which is not less important, of Fratelli Tutti, is a very direct appeal to religions to be builders of a world where the one human family can live in peace and in coexistence without walls. And I would say that if John Paul II was the Pope that has done more than anyone else to build bridges between the church and the Jewish people, Judaism, here Pope Francis is the Pope that has done the most, more than anyone else, to build bridges with Islam. In this sense, Pope Francis, from a historical point of view, is a Pope that understands very clearly the long-term effects of 9/11 and of the wars in the Middle East and of the failed uprising in Syria, in Egypt, and what that means for the Catholic Church, because it's not possible to build a physical wall between the Western Hemisphere or Europe and the Muslim world, but this is clearly what's happening in terms of a figurative wall, or a symbolic wall. So here Francis has done a lot to address this problem even before this encyclical, which again is a summation, it's a recapitulation and an elevation to a magisterial level of what he has said before and what he has done before. So here Francis has a history in his apostolic trips, to when it was possible for the Pope to travel, to go to places where walls are a key feature of that political history, of that spiritual history. He visited the walls between Israel and Palestine in 2014, the US-Mexico border in 2016, but from the Mexican side, which was incredibly powerful. In Sarajevo, in Bosnia, he addressed this issue of the walls in a community that has been devastated by civil war. He has visited many refugee camps, so which are a walled community outside the walls in many places of our world. He visited the Muslim Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh in 2017. But what is most interesting in Francis is this: he is a pope who has been incredibly deep and insightful in finding walls where we wouldn't think they exist. And that has been especially visible for me as an historian and as an Italian that has lived for a few months or more in Rome. He has done that with Rome. He has chosen from the very beginning, in his pontificate as Bishop of Rome, to cross invisible walls in the city of Rome between the Vatican and the left bank of the Tiber in the city of Rome, between the sacred city and the secular city. And Rome is one of the most secularized cities in the Western world. That invisible but impenetrable wall that there is in Rome between the capital of glamour and the Rome of the underworld, of the shanty towns, of the prison. So this is very interesting, because for Francis, walls are something very personal, because Francis has a particular social imagination. So here Francis' imagination is not rural, and it's even less suburban. His imagination, his anthropology is deeply urban, and cosmopolitan. He is a pope for the 21st century who has been a bishop, and now is Bishop of Rome, of a very, very complicated secular city with many religious identities, cultural identities, with many fault lines. And so for Francis, walls is not something historical or in some places far from Rome, but they are exactly where he lives. And the way he has ministered to this city of Rome, to his own diocese, it has always communicated from the very beginning that he's aware of many different kinds of walls that we don't see, but other people see, because it's mechanisms of exclusion are much more subtle than sometimes a physical wall. This social imaginary of Francis is very important because in this document and in other statements, and especially in the Abu Dhabi document of 2019, this idea of wall is related to the idea of citizenship. Here in Fratelli Tutti, there is a very important paragraph, 131, that again emphasizes again what Francis means by citizenship. And I'm going to read it for you, 131. For those who are not recent arrivals and already participate in the fabric of society, it is important to apply the concept of citizenship, which is based on the equality of rights and duties under which all enjoy justice. It is therefore crucial to establish in our societies the concept of full citizenship and to reject the discriminatory use of the term minorities, which engenders feelings of isolation and inferiority. Its misuse paves the way for hostility and discord. It undoes any successes and takes away the religious and civil rights of some citizens who are thus discriminated against. End quote. This is very important because here Francis is not just pointing our attention to a world of walls, of physical walls, but of other walls that are built against minorities, whether they're Christian or non-Christian minorities, ethnic or religious. This is really part of the crisis of globalization. You may have heard of this new political doctrine that in some countries has become the driving the policies, a doctrine called majoritarianism. So that the will of the majority will be enforced whatever the cost for minorities. It's something that we have seen in the rise lately of the so-called civilizational states. So where the state becomes not just the one in charge of the common good, but common good doesn't exist. It exists the good of the majority that belong to that civilization. And if you're not a member of that religious community or of that ethnic community, the common good doesn't apply to you. And so here Francis is rediscovering this idea of citizenship, which comes, it's a word that comes from the word city. So you are a member of the city with the rights and of the community. And so I find it extraordinary that a pope is talking about that as a religious leader, as the Pope of the Catholic Church. Now, there's one more element that makes this proposal of Pope Francis extraordinary, because here Pope Francis is not afraid of appropriating and reclaiming one of those words that belong to the worst possible nightmare for Catholics in political modernity, the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Here, fraternity, in that triad of freedom, equality, and fraternity, is the one that is impossible to legislate upon. One can legislate on the freedom or on equality, even if it's very difficult, but it takes something more and something else to be a human fraternity. It's very hard to delegate that entirely to a parliament or to a president. So here Francis is moved by a very strong civil passion. He's a Catholic, but he's a citizen of this world. So this So we tend now often to separate our religious identities from our civil identities or civil commitments. This is not, it's not Francis. It's not how he thinks. It's not how he understands the church and the world. So here Francis, in this encyclical, is proposing a new architecture of the world and of human relations. And this is really something more than a naive appeal to be nice and to be more compassionate. Because in this encyclical, again, because this is something typical of for Francis, we have a very important move. There's a shift of the church's emphasis from abstract doctrine to practices and lifestyle that lead to a new center of our ethics that is not about myself personally, individually, and God, but it's about the plural and collective dimension. So here Francis is impossible to frame in terms of liberal conservative, because for him there is a plural and collective dimension that doesn't fit with how modern liberalism thinks about the individual, and even less in the way conservative religious thinking uses Catholic teaching, because it tends to be more focused on an abstract doctrine than on practices, lifestyles that are measured on the standard of the plural and collective dimension of the common good. So here there is a strong indictment of Francis of a certain individualistic modernity, of individualistic consumerism, which is not just about, I mean, how many goods you can buy, but it's about reducing everything to something that can be bought and can be measured. And so there's a very strong critique of that, which is typical of the Catholic social teaching in the last 130 years. I mean, since Rerum Novarum of Pope Leo XIII. But there's also a very hopeful opening to what is possible in our human fraternity. Here, I want to read two short sentences from paragraphs 97 and 99. Quote, "There is an aspect of the universal openness of love that is not geographical but existential. It is the ability to broaden my circle, to reach those who spontaneously do not feel part of my world of interest, although they are close to me. The love that extends beyond borders is the basis of what we call social friendship in every city and every country." So in the last few minutes, what does it mean for us, for Catholics, for Christians, for those who read these documents? I think that Francis has already showed us how to do that. I mean, how to translate that in a few moments that have become really iconic of this pontificate. First, here Francis has rejected right away the idea that Catholicism can be defined in terms of exclusion. I am Catholic because I exclude X, Y, and Z. And so this is true, and it's news of these last few days of what Francis has said on LGBT Catholics, but also of other Christians or other members of communities that are not considered in full communion, either dogmatically or morally, with the Catholic Church. So here Francis has made very clear that he sees a non-exclusionary church, because this is applying to the church a mentality of walls. And so this doesn't mean that anything goes, but it means that you don't define your being a church or a member of the church on the basis of the list of those you exclude. Second, it's the importance of rejecting the almost automatic application of political cultures, political ideologies to the ecclesial community, locally or nationally or globally. This is a very dangerous thing, and I can say that just a few days from the election, this is something that has happened already, not only in the United States, but in other countries. So where is the political ideology that shapes your religious identity? This encyclical is a very strong message against this, I believe. Third, here Pope Francis, in this document, has made clear that he sees the Catholic Church in a different global position, no longer automatically aligned with an old ideological alignment between Catholicism and the Western Hemisphere, or Europe and North America. It's no longer true. That's what happens, thank God, I would say, when you have a Pope from the Southern Hemisphere. And so here there is a massive, huge new alignment that Francis is trying to let us understand it has already happened, and that we cannot cling on to the old NATO Catholicism of the 1950s, 1960s. Final question. So this is a very bold proposal from Pope Francis, Age of Walls and the Church. So here there are two main obstacles or the challenges to this proposal. First, how to save Pope Francis' proposal for this rebirth of Christianity and save this proposal from the political hegemony in some countries of neo-fundamentalist, neo-integralist Christian identities. This is something that we have seen in these last few years, and this is an intra-Catholic challenge. It's happening not only in non-Catholic churches, it's happening in the Catholic Church. A rise of Catholic strong identities that really believe in walls, really believe that exclusion is the way. This is a big challenge for Francis. Second challenge is this: how to say his proposal in a time of a world where fundamentalism in religion is common to other religions. Not just Christianity, but of course, Islam, Hinduism, Judaism. So it is common to these last few decades that we thought that religions were going to stay in the churches, in the sacristy. Actually, what we see is a comeback of a political identity of religious traditions. And this is really a big challenge. And I believe that this encyclical is a response both to the intra-ecclesial challenge of this neo-fundamentalism, neo-integralism, but also to a more global challenge of the rise of new fundamentalisms and new strong identities that rely really on the spirituality of walls and of exclusion. So I really thank you for this opportunity to read this encyclical Fratelli Tutti in depth, because it has allowed me to understand more of this encyclical. And I conclude here, and I'm really looking forward to hear your questions and your comments. Thank you very much.
Okay. Dr. Faggioli, thank you so much. That was truly interesting and so inspiring. And I read the encyclical just over the weekend, and after hearing your synthesis, I definitely will have to go back and reread it with these new insights. I want to introduce myself super quick. My name is Monica Hatcher, and I am an alumna of the Nesti Center for Faith and Culture. And I also work for a wonderful congregation of women religious here in Houston, called the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word. And I'm here to help facilitate this next segment of our program by facilitating the dialogue and a Q&A with the audience. So with that, I want to hand off to Father Nesti for his response to your wonderful commentary. So Father Nesti, we'll take a minute so you can unmute and turn your video on.
I think I'm unmuted now. I think you can see my face. Dr. Faggioli, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. You captured the icon that we need, the metaphor that we need, with the wall image, and how much we have a tendency to build those walls. In my time that's given to me, there are so many things that I would like to ask you about and have you continue to develop, but they're just one thing. Let's face it, some people try to oppose one pope to another, and look at Pope Francis and think that he's going off the deep end with some of his thinking. And they probably would like that passage in paragraph 127, where he says, after he's talking about reducing world debt and forgiving debt of poor countries and so forth and so on, he says, and I think this can apply to many people when they read the whole encyclical, what I am saying will sound wildly unrealistic. And I think that that's very true, because each of us, when we're challenged to take down the wall and go beyond frontiers, we find these things very unrealistic, and we would like to stay with our ideology. I'm very happy that you cited the bishops at the beginning of the Second Vatican Council, where they talk about the church being at the service of all humanity. I think it goes to there. I reread the conclusion of the Gaudium et Spes, the church in a modern world. Everything in that conclusion is found in Francis's encyclical itself. But the one that stands out the most to me, I think, here is Pope St. John Paul II in the Novo Millennio in Eunte, which is in which he talks about and he uses the definite article, the greatest challenge for the church in the 21st century is going to live a spirituality of communion, which means that I see everybody as a gift to me and myself as a gift to them. I wonder if you could just trace a little bit of us, for us, the connection between these papacies and even the sense of the development of doctrine, and moving from the abstract to the practical, as you said, as we go on in thinking about the magnificent insights that Pope Francis brings us, whether it's has to do with the integral ecology, and this is being another kind of integral ecology, and not the opposition of papacies.
Right. So I think you captured the Pope Francis dilemma. So, I mean, he has inherited a church and a world that have accelerated enormously in these last few years for good and bad. So he needs to say new things. But as you know, in the Catholic Church, there's this very strong emphasis on the continuity of the tradition. So here Francis, I believe, has been masterful in articulating the new and the old in a situation where on a wide range of issues, moral, social, it would be very easy to break away and say, well, it's a totally different situation. We need to say something completely new. So in Encyclical, he is actually very parsimonious. He doesn't quote very much from the previous tradition. But in this Encyclical, he says things in a very new synthesis, but there's very little that is totally new. So here, I mean, even those concepts that have made a few people, shocked, for example, on the private property. I mean, this concept that the private property is subordinated to the common good is in the Catholic tradition in the 12th century already. I mean, it's not new. So here, Pope Francis has inherited two incredibly popular papacies in different ways, John Paul and Benedict. And I see personally more analogies between John Paul and Francis, because John Paul had very similar accents, emphasis on his social vision and on his global vision, because I just want to say one thing. So usually ideologues of a certain Western Christianity that is supposed to rule the world, everything. So they credit Pope John Paul II of defeating communism. But in the social encyclical published by Pope John Paul II in 1991, he was already warning us in the Western world, don't get inebriated with the fall of communism, because liberal market economy is not the panacea. And there's a lot of Pope Francis there already. So I believe it is very unfair or ignorant to accuse Francis of being modernist or of not knowing the... So if there's one thing methodologically that I would advise him, and I wrote that in Commonwealth, is to make more clear the traditional sources that he knows and that he's using, and he tends to not be too scholarly on that, so which is also good for a pope probably. Okay, but there's nothing that is really in rupture with the tradition. I believe that if there is one very new emphasis that is a novelty, could be on war. And this is something that is a very, very important aspect of this teaching. But it's that aspect. All the rest, I believe, is a celebration of the Catholic tradition and not certainly of his own thoughts.
Thank you very much.
Father Binh, I want to invite you to respond and tell us what grasped your imagination from Dr. Faggioli's talk.
Thank you, Dr. Faggioli. I was really moved when you said that Pope Francis is very perceptive and very keen, and he has such an incredible insight into seeing walls, even within the church, even within the Vatican, and then see the walls within different groups within the church, subgroups within the church, and also within the church and the world. You mentioned that between Vatican and the secular Rome, you know. And I think that's one of the gifts I see as being a missionary. I worked in Asia for 16 years, you know, there's so many invisible walls. I just love the metaphor because, you know, I moved into a country just like China and worked there for 16 years. At the beginning, I was assuming that there was no walls. And this was a cultural wars between one family against another family, between one subgroup with another group, within patriotic church and the underground church, within the patriotic church in China. There's so many walls, and it's just unbelievable. And then when we become so naive, not seeing those walls, we become just like he said. Pope Francis said, we become slaves. And we become manipulated and controlled and wounded by the forces of the people who want to control. And maybe people are building the walls because of their fear of the unknown, fear of something different, fear of the otherness. And I see a lot of fear and insecurity in those who want to build walls. And I think so most of my studies, my works, have been focusing so much on, you know, the personal bias, group bias, cultural bias, even religious bias. You just talk about within the church. There are so many the fundamentalistic group and conservative groups, and trying to make sure that a clear border boundary in everything. And then I just love what you said about the important for us not to let the mechanic of exclusiveness to control. And then you identify how Pope Francis' heart is so inclusive. He's willing to reach out and serve everyone. How can we say that we are Catholic? How can we say that we are the members of the mystical body of Christ when we use the mechanic of exclusiveness in our ministry, in our pastoral service? And I think come to the point of the fact that when we have that fraternal charity, then we are not going to be passerby, you know, like the priest of the Levi, you know, in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Or if we're doing that all the time, then the number of the wounded persons getting more and more. Now we see in our culture now, the number of the passers-by are increasing. Those who just make themselves comfortable within their own wall. And because of that, there are so many people who are wall communities of the outside walls. It was really at the injured parties, the injured brothers and sisters, you know. And we need to have more good Samaritans. I think, you know, what I see, sometimes you try to be a good Samaritan like Pope Francis, sometimes you got being criticized and attacked and put down and misunderstood. And so I think it's very difficult. It's almost like, for me, it's prophetic, to be prophetic, to speak the truth. So my question is that how can we carry out a dialogue of truth if we are not talking about love? And I see that the fraternal love that of charity that Pope Francis is talking is really so important. It's foundational. If we don't have that fraternal charity, we have nothing to fall on to dialogue with others, to sit down and to be patient enough to listen to the other person's perspective and to hear other people's experiences of being wounded, being hurt, being violated, being abused sometimes by those who are maybe belong to the majority group, you know. And I think we all need to have a conversion. But sometimes I think right now I see a lot of finger pointing, you know, of other people. You know, he or she has a problem. Others have problem. I don't have the problem. So when I read the Encyclical, I think there is a call for us to go through the process of conversion. Conversion of our minds and our heart, and begin to identify, to be perceptive enough of how to recognize the walls that we are building, the wall that we allow to be erected around us, and acknowledge that without them, sometimes we believe that we will not be able to survive. So I think, can you help us to learn how to identify the walls, because later on there was one paragraph here, number 199, when Pope Francis say there's a need to have dialogue between generations, dialogue among our people, for we are that people, readiness to give, to receive, while remaining open to the truth. A country flourishes when a constructive dialogue occurs between its many rich cultural commoners, between popular culture, university culture, youth culture, artistic culture, technological culture, economic culture, family culture, political culture, media culture. How do we carry on dialogue when we still living in denial of all of those walls?
So the word dialogue is very important for Francis, and comes, I would say, from the emphasis of the Second Vatican Council and of Paul VI on dialogue. The word dialogue really becomes a fixture in the Catholic teaching with Paul VI. But here there's a difference in the way Francis imagines that. So here I suspect that for Paul VI was more a dialogue of ideas, of leaders, of intellectuals, and so on. Well, for Pope Francis, the fundamental dimension is the people. The key actor in history for Francis is the people. And so dialogue is not something intellectual for him, is not something cultural, but it's really, as he said many times, for his pastors, smelling like the sheep. So it's entering in this messiness of the human exchange with other people. And so it is really experiential. It comes through the senses: smell, touch, hear. So it's not something that can be done on paper. And this is a key for this encyclical. So if there's one thing that really Francis cannot stand in the church and in politics, is elitism. The elites. Is deeply anti-elitist. He cannot stand them. And so this encyclical is a message of understanding people's fears. So here, it's not always easy to live in this world, globalized world, in border areas, for example. So here, fears are real. So here, Pope Francis is really trying to save us, I believe, and from the instrumental use of our fears by some of our leaders, either political or in some cases ecclesial. So here, one thing is, don't expect that someone else will do dialogue for you at some level, and then it will trickle down. Francis doesn't believe in the trickle down theories for the economy, but also for ideas. So here, it's the church is a people among a bigger people. So it's really about removing the obstacles to join or remain in the church as a people and in the human community as people. So it's not about a particular group, a social interest group. No, it's about seeing yourself as one member like anyone else of these people. And so here Francis is a very good psychologist. He is a spiritual leader, but also as a very deep instrument to decode our fears. And so it's the existential, it's joining a community or remaining there and enter in this chaos, which is the human community. So without expecting or interjecting or projecting a particular identity. This is, so here Pope Francis is a middle of the road Catholic. He's an average Catholic that has become Pope. That is extraordinary. So that says a lot about our ecclesial moment and our political moment, I think.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Faggioli and Father Binh, for your comments and insights. We have about 20 minutes left of our event, and so we want to include some of our participants. We had over 90 people. That number is around 78 right now, so I just want to encourage everybody who's watching, if you do have a question, you can enter it into the Q&A box for Dr. Faggioli. In your talk, Dr. Faggioli, you did such a great job of pointing out how Pope Francis is diagnosing the walls in our midst. I really appreciated, these encyclicals are written for the ages, but they're written in a specific context, and it was very helpful to hear you cite the real walls that are going up in real countries around our world, like seeing the world through the Pope's eyes, and then also those invisible walls. So we know that they exist, we experience them everywhere. And you talked a little bit just now about how we can treat those walls. What is the antidote to those walls? And so we have a question here from one of our participants who's looking for some kind of practical advice. I mean, this Pope is so incredibly practical, so user-friendly. So an ordinary Catholic who became Pope, just like you said. And so we have a question here that asks for 3 steps that local Christian communities or individuals can take to help us break down walls in our local community, because it does start first within our own sphere of influence in our own communities.
So this is a very, very difficult question. So here I believe that what Francis has said on the church structure in other documents and so on is a Catholic who still believes in the centrality of the parish, of your local parish, or of a parish structure. And so I would say join or remain in a normal parish, and that membership in that parish should be more important than belonging to a particular group and so on, which is something that has become really part of the Catholic Church in this last half a century. I wrote extensively on the new groups, new movements that are a positive development, but at the same time they can create, subculture, sub-identities. And so here I would say that being member of the fundamental cell of the Catholic Church as it is structured today, because as you can imagine, the parish system has not always been there. It's a second millennium mostly, idea. And so be there, a member there, and then volunteer for something that you don't want to do. So be open to do something that you don't want to do, and so that you can reasonably try, okay, but it's not your best. So I'm a member of my parish here, and I'm very grateful to my parish priest because he never asked me to teach in the parish, because this is something that it would be so easy for me, but he asked me to do other things, and I'm very grateful because it's getting me out of my chair, of my lecture area in the parish. And third, in your parish, try to get close or to know more about other Catholics that you don't like, and not personally, physically, but whose culture you don't understand, whose pieties or whose devotions are not yours. that are more conservative than you or more liberal than you. And so that is being church. It's not about, I mean, being in the pew only with those that look like you, talk like you, think like you, but it's exactly the opposite. And so this is difficult. And that can be done in a parish community, parish structure, I believe, more than in other kinds of groups that are important, but that could not, they shouldn't supersede the fundamental membership in the Christian community as a people, where everyone is at the same level.
Well, here's another question about breaking down walls. It says, Francis does not seem to grasp the internal walls implicit in the church's hierarchy, whereby bishops operate in a system lacking accountability, transparency, and inclusion. Do you have a view on why he does not see this wall between pastors and the people of God as needing more than synodality, which of course is a good start?
This is a very good question, and I think the person who asked this question is right. So this is one issue on which Francis has been less courageous or more limited by a number of obstacles. So you're right. I wrote something about that in these last few months. Even this encyclical is more about a global vision than an ecclesial vision. So here in Fratelli Tutti, there's no discussion of clericalism. So you're right. So here Francis is very good in articulating the overcoming of the clerical system in terms of style, of how to be a better priest, a better bishop, not thinking that you are better than the lay people. But in terms of structural change, that is something that we haven't seen still. I believe that it is coming. So here there has the next Bishop Synod of 2022 will be on the theme of synodality, and there are initiatives that are preparing that synod, because clearly there are walls within our parishes, within our diocese, and there are walls that are determined by ordination, by gender, by social status. And so here Francis is very good in identifying walls that have to do with social status, much less, I would say, when it's about gender and when it's about ordination. So you're right. In this, Francis is not alone. So there are theologians, myself included, that are pushing on this, because this system is clearly unsustainable in the long run. And so here changes is happening in the long run, whether Francis wants it or not, or whether I want it or not. It's in the numbers. It's in the biography. It's in the biography of this church.
Dr. Faggioli, since you mentioned the gender walls, I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the lack of women voices in the Encyclical. I don't consider myself a feminist, but my sensibilities have definitely been heightened about the role of women in the church since I began working for a religious congregation. How is it possible that the Pope excluded women saints, women religious from this encyclical that quotes so many different voices from different faith traditions and different ethnicities, and leave us out?
You're right. That was a mistake. I think it looked bad. It was bad because at least Saint Clare or Assisi could have been mentioned, or when it was talking about immigration, Saint Francis Cabrini. So it would have been easy. So here there is a problem of manufacturing of the text, and of the team around Francis that didn't consider that suggestion to the Pope important. So here, popes never work alone, right? So here, I believe that we know that every encyclical is under the responsibility of the Pope, his signature, and so on. But there's always a drafting process that involves a small group of people. And so here, so that was a mistake, and that was done at that level. That's not just Francis, and not. I believe this is it is part of Francis' biography. Of his being a Latin American Jesuit, was born in the 30s, and he has never been really shaped by an intellectual exchange with women. So he has worked a lot with women outside of the church. It is strange, but not in the church. So that was a mistake. And I believe that a few of us have pointed out that mistake, and now they are aware of that. And next time, probably they will keep an eye on that.
I know if he had even had just a woman like proofreading a draft, probably would have said, Pope, you
Absolutely.
know, you might want to
Absolutely.
So anyways, we have another question here. It says a lot of people are saying that Fratelli Tutti and the recent comments on Francesco, the documentary, have changed the church's teaching on the death penalty. It is now considered intrinsically wrong. And just war. It is no longer thought that there is any just war. And LGBTQ civil unions. In your opinion, is this take on events correct? And if so, what can Catholics look to as a criteria for what the teachings we can expect to change in the future?
So here, again, this is a very pointed question. So I believe that we should distinguish. So on death penalty and on just war, what Pope Francis has done in his encyclical and in previous statements, he has further developed a few decisions that were made by his predecessors, especially John Paul II on just war and on death penalty. So here on just war, already at Vatican II, there is a re-examination of the just war doctrine in light of nuclear war and of nuclear warfare and of modern warfare, which now involves much more civilians than soldiers. And so that begins in the 60s on just war. And on death penalty, it begins with John Paul II, who repeatedly, you may remember, he always appealed to US presidents not to go and execute in United States prisons. And so here Pope Francis has made that more definitive, but he hasn't innovated that much, in my opinion. It's different on the LGBT issue because in Francis, we don't have yet, at least, a formal change in the teaching of the church on marriage and on sexuality. There is very clearly and very important a pastoral and pragmatic and prudential new language, which, for example, says that gay couples should enjoy the protection of the law with civil unions, which is something that actually it shouldn't be the Pope's task to concede that, to grant that to them. It should be our states, our governments that are in charge of that. But anyway, so Pope Francis has really changed the language of the papacy on civil unions, which until the early 2000s was very much opposed. Again, secular states giving recognition to same-sex unions. Okay, but so there's a distinction because on LGBT, Pope Francis has innovated on practical, pastoral, pragmatic issues and not on the teaching on marriage, as we know that there is in Amoris Laetitia, as the product of the Synod on the Family and Marriage of 2014-2015.
Great. I want to invite Father Nesti and Father Binh to enter into the questions if they have an extra point to make. But we have two more questions here that are somewhat related. Let's see. It says, what insights do you have to share to help bridge the gap between those who see Pope Francis as a breath of fresh air, opening up a new space of dialogue within the church and the world, and those who see him as too accommodationist to developments in the modern world? Can one follow the Francis option and the Benedict option at the same time? And then someone asked something about how to reach those faithful who are on the pre-Vatican II side of the wall within the Catholic Church, of reaching those who see fraternity and equality as French Revolution evils that you sort of suggested in your comments.
So let me begin by the second question. So here, the problem in the Catholic Church is not to be pre-Vatican II. It's not the problem. It's being anti-Vatican II, which is a problem. So here, I have Eastern Catholic friends in the Middle East whose churches have never really fully, implemented Vatican II, especially in the liturgy. And so they are pre-Vatican II, but they're not anti-Vatican II. So here in the Catholic Church, dialogue becomes difficult when some Catholics think that they are more Catholic than Pope Francis or more Catholic than the Second Vatican Council, and of all popes after the Vatican II that have implemented the teaching of the Second Vatican Council. So here, I'm not advocating for the exclusion of those who think Vatican II was a big mistake. I would also invite them to read something more on what John Paul II and what Pope Benedict have said and have written on the Second Vatican Council. So this is a problem that I would say is much more evident in the United States than anywhere else in the world. This is part of a certain American exceptionalism in the Catholic Church. Your first question, I think Francis is much more a middle-of-the-road pope than the unhappy Catholics that see him as an extremist on the one hand or other are ready to acknowledge. So here there is no Francis option, I think. So there's a Catholic Church option. So that cannot be identified with Francis exclusively. If the question was on the Benedict option, as it has been labeled by Rod Dreher, I think that option has very little to do and to say to Catholics. It's a retreat option that has nothing to do with Benedict. With Pope Benedict, it has nothing to do with monasticism. It is a political protest that is shaped as a theological argument that has no substance. So here Francis has always been very much in favor of the church as a big tent, as inclusive as possible, even with those who are against Vatican II. Lefebvre writes. And so here one cannot accuse Francis of initiating purges or so on. This is really far from the truth.
Thank you. I am so sad to say that we've kind of run out of time when obviously there's so many more questions that have been posed. I'm sure Father Nesti and Father Binh have questions too. I just wanted to point out one line from the encyclical that I thought was really important about our lives as Catholics in the midst of all these walls. He says it in paragraph 92. The spiritual stature of a person's life is measured by love, which in the end remains the criterion for the definitive decision about a human life's worth or lack thereof. He says, we need to recognize that love takes first place. Love must never be put at risk. And the greatest danger lies in failing to love. And when we set up walls, we fail to love. So Dr. Faggioli, thank you very much. I'm going to hand off now to Dr. Squires and then Dr. Binh, who are going to close out our program.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica, and thank you, Dr. Faggioli, for your insights into this latest text from Pope Francis. Just one quick comment to our listeners, to our viewers. The Center for Faith and Culture, we do quite a few things. One of the things that we do is that we have a podcast. It's called Catholicism and Culture. It can be found on pretty much any podcast platform. We publish episodes every 2 weeks. And this presentation from Dr. Faggioli is going to be posted on that podcast in about 10 days or so. So if you want to maybe go read or reread the encyclical and then listen to this presentation again, or pass it on to some friends or colleagues that you think would benefit from Dr. Faggioli's presentation. And it also, in the coming days, will be posted on the University of St. Thomas's YouTube page. And with that, I will hand this over to the director of the Center for Faith and Culture, Father Binh, for the final comments.
I just want to thank especially Dr. Faggioli for your sharing today. I think you give us such a very comprehensive view of the encyclical, and also giving us a lot of encouragement to participate in the process of dialogue, to break down the walls and to build bridges. I just want to thank all of the participants of today's event. And thank you for your support of the mission of the center and for engage in the dialogue. I just want to make a few announcements. This coming year, the year of 2021, the Nesti Center adopted as the year of family. We will have all the events focusing on family life. We will look at academic institution as family. We look at family of origin, generational family, the gaps between generations, how we dialogue. Extended family, parish community as family, and family as domestic church. And we also will launch our Family Life Certificate Program in collaboration with the Archdiocese of Galveston, Houston. The Family Life Program provides a solid, vibrant, updated, and pastoral formation in family life, designed for its application in today's life and ministry. We know how important it is, even in the encyclical Pope talk of families, how we need to provide that sense of being at home, in that sense of being brothers and sisters in the one family, united in the love of God. If you want to participate in these events and our program, please log in at our website at stthomas.au, CFC. If you would like to make any donations to support for the works and the mission of the center, you will see on the share screen now. You can send the email to us and just let us know you would like to make a donation, and then we will guide you how to do that. Okay, so you can send an email to cfc@stthomas.au. Thank you so much. Thank you for all of the panelists. Thank you, Father Nesti, Dr. Stuart Squires, and Monica for your wonderful moderations. And thank you, preachers, for your help, and Scott for bringing all of us together to share on something so important, and to learn how to break down the walls, how to build bridges, how to see and love one another as brothers and sisters in Christ. Thank you. May God bless you all. Have a graceful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao.